This video will demonstrate how to take the results of an ANOVA analysis and organize those results and convert them into a written results section. So first we'll talk about how to organize the information, and then we'll go through some specific examples of how to write a potential result section for an analysis of variance. So our first step is to make sure we're going to organize our results. And one of the first steps is to make sure you have descriptive data and descriptive information for your groups. So that could include demographic information, and will certainly include the descriptive information for the outcomes that you may be measuring in your study. The other thing you have to do is be able to identify the reason for the analysis. In other words, each analysis needs to be able to be identified with a specific hypothesis and vice versa. You'll then also need to be able to describe the analysis in specific detail. Are you doing a one-way ANOVA? Are you doing a two-way ANOVA? Are you doing repeated measures ANOVA? And so on. Then you're going to take all that information and convert it into a narrative format in which you'll actually report the results, including the specific results of the data analysis technique. It's important to remember when we're writing our results, this is not the place to offer detailed interpretation of why the results turned out the way they did. This is the area where you're going to talk about what you did, why you did it, and how you did it, and then be able to report the results of that analysis. So first of all, describing your groups. So we want to make sure we provide a detailed breakdown of subject characteristics by group. That's certainly going to be important for replication of your study. So that can include any demographic information that may be relevant to your study, such as age, sex, height, weight, and so on. We want to make sure we include the appropriate measure of central tendency for each characteristic. So if you're doing height and weight, for example, that would probably be the mean or perhaps the median. But if you're talking about distribution of sex among your groups, that would probably be the mode or percentage. We also want to make sure we're providing a measure of variance for each characteristic as appropriate, and that would include the standard deviation and the confidence intervals for each characteristic. And this is best done with a table in which we can list all these different characteristics by row, and then in each column list your mean, your standard deviation, your confidence interval, and so on. And so when you get SPSS output, that information should be there for you, and it's really just a matter of you organizing it and finding it. So for example, we have two groups here. We have the mean of their outcome, we have the confidence interval of that outcome, we have lots of other descriptive information about that particular characteristic. So it's easy to find and organize into a table. And this would be an example of a table that we would use to organize by characteristic and by group using mean, standard deviation, and confidence interval. Okay, so our first step then as we begin to construct the actual narrative format of your results is to be able to succinctly identify the reason for the analysis. As I mentioned before, you want to be able to orient the reader to which hypothesis is going with which analysis. And so we want to provide a very quick rationale, a very quick synopsis of the analysis itself. So two examples of this might be, in order to assess the effect of the treatment on the control group compared to two additional treatment groups, or another might be, the goal of determining the effect of the treatment over 4 measurement points was realized by performing a one-way repeated measures ANOVA. So we're very quickly, succinctly identifying what the goal is for that particular analysis. Okay, the next thing we want to be able to do is specifically identify the type of analysis that we're doing. And as you may know, when we get into ANOVA, we have lots of different variations of analysis of variance that can be performed, depending on the number of independent variables you have, depending on the number of dependent variables you have, and even depending on whether or not you have a covariate. So we want to be as specific as possible when we're describing that analysis. So an example might be a one-way analysis of variance was performed. Some more detailed examples in which we actually include identifying the independent and dependent variables, which I would recommend, include our next two examples. So a one-way ANOVA was performed to compare the blood glucose levels for the two medication groups and the placebo group. So here I've got my rationale as well as my technique as well as my different variables that are being added into the analysis. The other example, a 2 in parentheses group by 2 pre-post test, mixed model, and COVA was conducted to evaluate the efficacy of the treatment in reducing anxiety levels compared to control. So again, we're being very specific as to why we're doing what we're doing, what it is we're doing, and what variables we're using to do it. Now, when we report the results in an ANOVA, this is obviously going to can be quite a large section depending on how many analyses we do and how complex our analysis is. A few things you want to make sure you're including when you report the actual results. This is the actual results of the analysis themselves. So we want to indicate if any assumptions or if the assumptions were met for the test. And we want to be specific as to how we determined if the assumptions were met. And you'll see some examples of that shortly. We will, of course, want to report the degrees of freedom, the actual test statistic, the F-score in this case, what the exact p-value was associated with that F-score, and then also indicate for the reader if you're considering that result to be statistically significant or not. We also someplace want to include the mean, standard deviation, and confidence intervals for each outcome measured by group. And again, that can be done in the narrative or it could be done in a table form. We want to report effect sizes and then other measures of clinical significance you might be using, including statistical power. We could also report things like the minimal clinically important difference or clinically important change. Could be other things that we could report relative to the analysis. It's important that we always report the main effects of the ANOVA followed by a post hoc. So if we've got three groups, we want to first report the main effect if that's significant, and then we can report the results of our post hocs. Okay, this is also going to be true if you've got a factorial ANOVA. You want to report the main effects, then the interaction, and then the post hocs if you're doing those. Okay, so here's some examples. So here's an example of a results section for a one-way ANOVA. And again, you can see in the very first sentence, we describe what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. Okay, we're doing a one-way between groups ANOVA to compare the impact of age groups on job satisfaction. Okay, and then the next line indicates what our independent variable is. In other words, what levels of independent variables we might have. The next sentence indicates whether or not we've met the assumptions for doing a one-way ANOVA, and again we report Levine's tests results to indicate that we have met that assumption of equality of variance. The next line, we're reporting whether or not there was statistical significance, and we're reporting the actual F-score of the one-way ANOVA, degrees of freedom, and then the p-value. We're also reporting the magnitude of the difference. In this case, we're reporting an effect size of partial eta squared. We also are reporting, in this example, statistical power. Then the very last group of sentences are the post hoc comparisons. And here's where we're reporting the means for each group, as well as standard deviation, as well as confidence intervals for each of the group while we're discussing the results of the post hoc exam or post hoc tests. So this allows us to be able to be very concise but report a large amount of information. Okay, the next example is for a one-way repeated measures ANOVA. And again, we can be able to pick out those same characteristics in this example. We're describing what analysis we did, why we were doing it. We give an indication of what the variables are, in this case time points. We refer the reader in this case to see the means, standard deviations, and confidence intervals for each time point in a table, so we're not directly reporting them here in the narrative, but we can refer to our readers to a table. And then lastly, we report statistical significance. We report our F statistic, our Wilks lambda, the p-value, and then our effect size. Now the next example is for a factorial ANOVA. So we have a two-way between groups ANOVA, and we're talking about looking at exploring the effect of age and sex on job satisfaction in this case. And you'll see a lot of similarities in this example to what we saw in our one-way ANOVA. So we indicate what our variables are. We indicate if we had main effects or interaction effects. We indicate whether or not we've met the assumptions. And then we talk about effect size, statistical power. Then at the last third or so of the paragraph, we get into the post hoc comparisons that we did, as well as talk about the main effect that was not significant. Now our last example is using an ANOVA analysis of covariance. And again, we can see in the first few sentences, we are very succinct in describing what our intention is with the analysis, what analysis we did, what our independent and dependent variables are, and in this case, what our covariate will be in this analysis. Then in the second paragraph, the first few sentences, we talk about meeting the assumptions of the analysis. And then in the last couple sections, or last sentence or so, we then report the results of the analysis itself, whether or not there was statistical significance. We report the F-score, we report the p-value, the partial eta squared. Now in this case, again, we could report the means of each of the groups, standard deviations and confidence intervals in a table. That's not reported in the narrative, but that is another way we could approach that. So hopefully this gives you a pretty good sense of how we can organize result sections for different types of ANOVAs. And again, hopefully you saw a lot of similarities between these. And even with more complex types of ANOVAs than what I used here in these examples, you can continue to apply these same principles as you write these result sections. So hopefully you learned something from this video, and good luck using these techniques in your own research.